in Vietnam. But if you look at a lot of the information that has emerged since, and even some of the indications that existed at the time, it's clear that starting in the late 1950s, the Soviet Union and the government of China, the People's Republic of China, started to drift apart. And I've often wondered, and clearly when Mr. Nixon and Dr. Kissinger came to office, they were much more aware of this and saw this as some kind of an opportunity, a diplomatic opportunity for us. And that certainly was one of the reasons for President Nixon's famous trip to China in February 1972. But I sometimes wonder if perhaps Lyndon Johnson and those around him might have made better use of the fact of differences between the Russians and the Chinese earlier than we actually did. And then, of course, the last question, which I think has a lot to do with the ultimate collapse of South Vietnam, of the South Vietnamese government, and that is, what if Richard Nixon had not been undone by the internal political developments here in the United States? Well, these are all matters of speculation, and I just raise them because they help us think a little bit about these questions. There's also what I would call some of the myths that go around about Vietnam. I think our thinking in this country now is getting a bit clearer than it was earlier on, but I suppose the first myth that I would mention is the myth in the minds of some people that this was an unjust war, that is to say, the American experience in Vietnam and the war that took place to defend South Vietnam from the North was in some respect unjust. And that's obviously wrong. I, for one, believe that, and believe to this day that, like Ronald Reagan would say, that it was a noble cause. Thank you. Another myth, I think this one kind of hurt us at the time, and that was that the Tet Offensive was a military defeat. I think there was a real negative psychology that overtook the atmosphere here in Washington after the Tet Offensive, which we learned in the next several years had really decimated the Viet Cong and had actually, you saw the improvements in security over much of South Vietnam in 1969, 70, 71, and so forth, as a consequence of the tremendous losses that the communists had suffered during the Tet Offensive. I sometimes wonder if Mr. Westmoreland, General Westmoreland, didn't compound that problem, in a way, by then, in the wake of the Tet Offensive, asking for 200,000 more troops. And I think that kind of reinforced the pessimistic thinking that existed here at the top of our leadership. Another myth is that we lost a guerrilla war. I don't think we lost a guerrilla war. I think it's pretty clear that the only way that Hanoi could win this was through a conventional invasion. I remember very well, I was just here several blocks away in the National Security Council during Easter of 1972 when the North Vietnamese tanks came across the border and carried out basically conventional attacks on Vietnamese forces. And the Vietnamese, I remember the 1st Darwin Division fought like hell and defended itself magnificently. And we ultimately, after the mining of Haiphong and the bombing of Hanoi, and President Nixon was adamant about doing that because, and he did it on the 8th of May, 1972, he was adamant because he had a scheduled meeting with his first meeting with Leonid Brezhnev scheduled on May 22nd in Moscow, and he felt he could not go to Moscow while one of their clients, if you will, was attacking our ally in this blatant kind of way, and without any kind of response from the United States. There was the parallel myth that both that the ARVN wasn't good, and that the government of South Vietnam was sort of a corrupt, failed enterprise. I traveled around and got to know Vietnam well enough to know that those generalizations simply are not true. I would agree with one proposition, which is I think that perhaps we started putting real emphasis on Vietnamization a bit late. And I've noticed that that's a pattern in our response to other situations that have taken place since. I felt that that was the case in Iraq. When I went there as ambassador, after Jerry Bremer had been the head of the Coalition Provisional Authority, I found only one Iraqi battalion there. They had dissolved the previous army, and they had just started building up a new army, but they hadn't gotten very far in that more than 1 year since we had invaded Iraq. Now, they have almost 200 battalions, and they have a large police force. But these kinds of situations, it seems to me, require a very early and intense effort to help build local capabilities, because in the end, there's no substitute for local capacity and local capability in dealing with these kinds of situations. So we each walk around, I guess, with our own little mental image of what we consider to be our lessons from Vietnam, and I think it's hard to do that, and I think one has to be cautious in inferring too many lessons, because new facts emerge, new situations evolve, one's thinking evolves. I think all of us obviously our thinking about Vietnam has evolved since the time of the war. But having subsequently worked on other situations, I mentioned Iraq. As Deputy Secretary of State, of course, I was involved with our policy towards Afghanistan. Likewise, when I was Director of National Intelligence, I had an opportunity to take a close look at these kinds of situations. And I suppose now, speaking from the United States point of view, I think that the lesson number one is be careful before you take the first step. And I think that, having a good assessment, a good appreciation of what you're getting yourself into, having a good appreciation of the various costs that you think might be involved, and of the different elements of a situation that you're going to have to deal with once you take that first step. Let me give you an example unrelated to Vietnam. I think there was a bit of a feeling in regard to Iraq in the spring of 2003 that all we had to do was go in, knock out Saddam Hussein, capture Baghdad, and pretty much everything else was going to take care of itself. I believe no one said that explicitly, but I think that was sort of the prevailing attitude. And then we set about learning all the different problems that we were going to face. So, to the best of one's ability, none of us have a crystal ball. None of us can tell the future. We don't know the future. But you have to put quite a bit of emphasis on understanding your geopolitical situation, not only broadly speaking, but also understanding the facts on the ground as best you can. My second lesson would be that when you've taken that first step, I think then you need great clarity of purpose and a very thorough understanding, as I just said, of both the local situation and the surrounding international circumstances. And that sometimes can be very challenging. I wrote a whole article a number of years back about the difficulty of figuring out what was going on in Vietnam. Here we were foreigners, we didn't speak the language particularly well, we had imperfect knowledge. It's not that easy to understand the circumstances of a completely different culture. I learned when I was studying Vietnamese that it is only one cognate between the English and Vietnamese languages. You know, I mean, in French or in Italian or Spanish, we have Latin roots, and they're all the same. There are many of them the same. I think the only cognate between English and Vietnamese is the fruit, kumquat, the kumquat fruit. And we use, huh? What do we call it? Yeah. But I don't know that there are any other cognates. And maybe that one wasn't one either. Some of these lessons are very applicable to American policies today, whether it's in Afghanistan and Pakistan or with respect to Iraq. And it's going to be applicable in the future, because if there is a serious threat out there, one of them certainly is the possibility of failed states. States that lose control of their territories, and then that opens, makes those spaces available for various types of criminal activity, whether it's narcotics or criminal contraband or international terrorism. And as long as a system of nation states is the foundation of the international system, we have to be concerned about what do we do, both as an international community as a whole, and what do we as the United States do when we see these looming disasters of failed state X or failed state Y, and what should we do about it to alleviate the situation so that we can avoid problems in the future. One other lesson I learned personally about Vietnam, and which served me very, very well in Iraq, which is a sort of something unique for Americans, but it is the issue of how important in confronting these situations is the matter of civilian-military cooperation. And I felt I learned a lot from Ellsworth Bunker, who was ambassador out there. I think he in particular, he had a mission council, and he and General Westmoreland worked very closely together, and then later on he worked very well with General Abrams. And I tried to use a little bit the model in Iraq in my dealings with General Casey, who was my military counterpart. We actually took it a step further. We had offices right adjacent to each other. We wrote a joint mission plan, civilian and military, for Iraq, and then we spelled it out and signed it and adopted it as our joint policy for dealing with the issues. It was a very good exercise, I think, and I think it helped guide the performance of people on both the civilian and military branches. Well, I've talked long enough. Yeah, I just would say, lastly, that for me, service in Vietnam was not just one assignment, but it was really a career-defining and a life-defining experience that has kept recurring in my life in different ways, and so I hope to be able to visit Vietnam and to deal with this question and others often in the future, perhaps not quite as intensively as I did in the past, but let me reiterate again what a pleasure it is to be with you here this afternoon. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I think Ambassador has time for a few questions. Those of you who want to ask.
I don't know if there's a, oh, okay, Lacey. Then I'll repeat the question if your voice isn't. Oh, there's a mic. There we go. Good. Mr. Wright.
Lacey Wright, State Department. Mr. Secretary, one of the situations that played a big role in Vietnam is now recurring in the recent days in Afghanistan is the question of how we should treat our allies, particularly in public. The excellent book written by Rufus Phillips talks about how we backed President Diem into a corner in the view of a lot of people and made it very difficult for him to do the things that we wanted him to do. We now have a situation in Afghanistan where, again, we're criticizing our ally in public, and people are starting to say that is making it very difficult for him to do the things that we want him to do. How do you resolve this tension between these two imperatives? On the one hand, we need to show our own people that we are doing something. On the other hand, we're simultaneously risking undermining our ally.
Well, it's a great question to which, Lacey, I think there is no absolutely easy answer. And I think that to some extent it's a matter of style and approach by the individuals with responsibility. I always argued for quiet diplomacy. Sometimes I was criticized by some of the human rights groups and others for not being vocal enough, say, with respect to human rights situations that had come to my attention. But I, for one, felt that these were issues that were legitimate for us to raise, but I felt that we would likely be more effective with the governments to which we were accredited if we did it privately and quietly. It puts a premium, it seems to me, on good language, area expertise. It puts a premium, I think, on using professional diplomats as much as possible to handle these situations. And what you really want out of an ambassador or someone in the field is for them to be able to develop the kind of relationships with their counterparts so that they can be effective in persuading them to deal with some of these issues in particular ways. So I think it's one of the challenges of our diplomacy. But having said that, when you're talking about a democracy like the United States, you're always going to get public commentary that might cause you controversy in that, in country X, Y, or Z. I used to get protests from the Mexican Foreign Ministry about things that were said by Senator Jesse Helms on the floor of the Senate. And they would be front-page headlines in Mexico, and I couldn't even find his remarks in the American newspapers. So you know what I'm talking about, that sometimes people take umbrage at what our press or our senators or congressmen may say, but there's only so much that we can do about that.
Good afternoon, Mr. Speaker. I am the officer engaged in battle for peace since day one until the last day. And after take offensive, I see enemy got a lot of casualty, and we can go from Hue to Asai Valley and anywhere, no contact. That means North Vietnam have withdrawn to the Laos. And I don't know why. That means that we got a lot of victory in Negroponte, and we have we show to the worldwide that North Vietnam, the aggressive, not U.S. invader. We show to everybody that North Vietnam is to invade South Vietnam. Why U.S. said we lost after Negroponte?
Yeah.
The first question. Second question, I'd like to ask you, you are in the circle of the White House. So this is the question of the historic question. Whether U.S. government want to get relation with China. So U.S. have left behind the ally, South Vietnam.
Yeah. All right. In my remarks, I also mentioned the question of the Tet Offensive, and I agree with you. It was a defeat for the communists in military terms, and one of the fears I think that Lyndon Johnson and Mr. Rusk had, and I would have to go back and research some of this, but I think they had a concern about it. If we escalated beyond a certain level, like if we'd sent troops across the border, or had gone into Laos, and so forth, or had gone across and cut off the entire 17th parallel, I think there was a fear that China might somehow enter into the war. People will remember, don't forget, Dean Rusk, the Secretary of State, and he was Secretary of State for the entire 8 years. He had been Assistant Secretary of State for East Asia during the Korean War. And I think he really had a kind of a Korean War perspective on this, and the fear that China might somehow come in on the ground, which I do not believe was a danger. But, you know, we're talking about hypothetical situations. Your question is well taken. I think we could have certainly had a different attitude towards Tet than we developed. So you have to try and explain to yourself, why did that happen? I think it happened because President Johnson actually became exhausted thinking about the Vietnam question. I think he was politically and psychologically exhausted. He must have been, because look what happened. 2 months after Tet occurred, he resigned he announced that he wouldn't run again for office. So I think it was a loss of political will on his part. On the second question, I would not agree that we did anything to please China. To the contrary, I mean, I don't think that was a consideration in the concluding the Paris peace agreement. Absolutely not. Thank you very much.
Yes, sir. One more
I think we are wearing our conversation.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, because there is another part of after this land that is equally moving, which is the testimonial from all the friends of Vietnam. And I do thank you, John.
Our next session will be a series of videos, but before we get started with that, I would like to take this opportunity to deliver some remarks from two very important individuals. They were not able to be here with us, but they have sent their greetings and wishes, and it's my honor to be given this little task to deliver their remarks. The first one is an excerpt from a letter of General Wayan. The letter was written on April 4th, in 2005 to Ms. Nina Nguyen, Director of VNTV in Honolulu, Hawaii. And this is just a small part from a long letter that he has written. As I look back on my Vietnam experience, I am proud of the brave South Vietnamese soldiers, airmen, sailors, and Marines who fought, bled, and died for their country. It is a tribute to those gallant warriors that, when things looked the blackest after the American withdrawal, they volunteered in great numbers than ever before. As President Thieu reminded me, they had hope. Sadly, we let them down. With all of this, my spirit is buoyed by what your South Vietnamese compatriots have done wherever they have settled. Today, those who have evacuated to America are major contributors in every field: doctors, lawyers, judges, teachers, professional athletics, businessmen. They have involved themselves in the political process of the conviction that democracy is mankind's only insurance against tyranny and oppression. That lesson is evident as we struggle with the forces of terrorism that threaten us globally. My thoughts today are a mixture of deep regret, pride, and affection for the people of South Vietnam. They have shown that to be free, man must be the master of his own fate. They have created a legacy of character and achievement that does great honor to South Vietnam. I am proud to have been associated with them in any way. God bless you sincerely. Fred C. Wayne, General, U.S. Army, retired. The second one is a statement from Dr. Louis Sorley, former 69th Armored Tank Battalion, also the author of the book Better War. Greeting to all who are assembled today in honor and memory of those who fought together for freedom and justice in the Vietnam War. I regret that my family obligations have kept me from being with you. I'm very proud of you all and of your service and sacrifice. It was an honor and a privilege to serve alongside with you. I also want to express my admiration for our Vietnamese comrades and their families who have made America their new home. We are fortunate to have you as our countrymen and are inspired by your contributions to our culture and well-being. So the next, before we go back to upstairs for the continuation of today's discussion, we'd like to introduce a compendium of videos that were put together by some... I'm sorry, I just lost my train of thought. So, is the video ready?
Yes.